My husband had not touched me like a wife in 3 years, and somehow I spent most of that time convincing myself it was normal. At 68 years old, you become very skilled at explaining away loneliness. You call it aging, stress, retirement fatigue, health changes, anything except the truth sitting quietly beside you in bed every night. Thomas slept facing the opposite wall for so long that eventually I stopped remembering what it felt like to be held without asking first. The strange part was not the absence of intimacy itself. It was how polite the distance became. He still opened doors for me in public, still called me Maggie, in that soft southern voice people always admired during dinner parties, still poured me wine during charity events and introduced me proudly as his wife whenever we attended retirement galas downtown. From the outside, we looked elegant together, stable, wealthy, married for 42 years, and aging gracefully inside our historic Charleston home with white columns and climbing jasmine along the front porch. But inside that house, silence had started replacing affection room by room. The first year, I thought Thomas was depressed after retirement. He spent more time alone reading financial reports in his office and less time beside me in the evenings. When I touched his arm during movies, he smiled distractedly without really noticing. When I kissed him goodnight, he kissed my forehead gently like I was a relative instead of his wife. "I am tired," he always said softly afterward. I believed him because loving someone for 40 years teaches you trust before suspicion. By the second year, I started changing things about myself quietly. New hair color, expensive skin creams, Pilates classes twice a week, even though my knees hurt afterward. I lost 15 pounds and bought silk nightgowns I felt ridiculous wearing at my age. Thomas barely looked up from his newspaper the first night I wore one. "You look nice," he said absent-mindedly before turning another page. Nice. I stood alone in the bathroom afterwards staring at my reflection beneath soft vanity lights, wondering when exactly marriage became something that survived entirely on routine instead of connection. Around that same time, Thomas began sleeping downstairs more often. At first it was because of his back, then because he fell asleep watching television. Eventually we stopped pretending there was a reason at all. One night, I woke up around 3 in the morning and walked downstairs for water. I found him sitting alone in the dark living room staring at his phone with a smile I had not seen directed toward me in years. The screen immediately went black the moment he noticed me standing there. "Could not sleep?" I asked quietly. "Just checking emails." He sounded too fast, too careful. But instead of questioning him, I apologized for interrupting and returned upstairs carrying my loneliness like something fragile I needed to protect from embarrassment. That is the humiliating thing about emotional rejection after decades of marriage. You stop asking difficult questions because part of you already fears the answers. Charleston summers feel heavy in old houses. Humid air settles into every room while ceiling fans spin endlessly against the heat. During those long evenings, Thomas and I often sat on opposite ends of the porch drinking iced tea in silence, while cicadas screamed through the magnolia trees outside. Sometimes I caught myself studying married couples at restaurants downtown with embarrassing fascination. A husband touching his wife's back while walking through crowded streets. A woman leaning her head briefly against her partner's shoulder during dinner. Tiny ordinary gestures that suddenly felt foreign to me. One evening, while folding laundry upstairs, I found myself holding one of Thomas's dress shirts against my chest, just trying to remember what closeness used to feel like. That was the moment I realized how desperate I had quietly become. Not for passion, just tenderness, human warmth. 3 years without a real embrace changes something inside a person slowly. You begin shrinking emotionally without noticing. Speaking softer, asking for less. Pretending distance no longer hurts because admitting the truth feels too humiliating after 42 years of marriage. Around Thanksgiving that year, our daughter Emily visited from Charlotte with her husband and children. During dinner, she suddenly looked at Thomas and laughed. "Dad, do you even realize you have not touched Mom once all night?" The room went silent immediately. Thomas smiled politely and reached across the table to squeeze my hand for exactly 2 seconds before returning to his mashed potatoes. Everyone laughed awkwardly afterward, like Emily accidentally committed some social crime. But later that night, standing alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes while rain tapped softly against the windows, her words echoed painfully inside my head. She noticed, which meant maybe other people noticed too. Maybe our marriage had become one of those quiet tragedies everybody sees, but nobody mentions directly out of politeness. That night, I climbed into our king-sized bed alone again, while Thomas remained downstairs watching television until after midnight. I stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly in the darkness, while tears slipped silently into my hairline. Not because I missed physical intimacy. I missed feeling chosen, wanted, seen. Somewhere downstairs, floorboards creaked softly beneath Thomas's footsteps before silence settled over the house once more. And lying there alone in the dark Charleston night beside untouched pillows and cooling sheets, I finally allowed myself to wonder the question I had avoided for 3 long years. What if my husband was not simply tired anymore? What if he had already left me emotionally long before I noticed I was sleeping alone? By the middle of the 3rd year, I stopped trying to initiate affection altogether. That realization came quietly one Sunday morning while I stood in front of the bathroom mirror applying lipstick before church. The tube paused in my hand halfway through because suddenly I understood something humiliating. I was getting dressed for a man who no longer looked at me carefully enough to notice whether I wore lipstick at all. The thought stayed with me all morning afterward. Through hymns, through polite conversations over coffee in the church courtyard, through lunch at our favorite seafood restaurant downtown, where Thomas spent most of the meal answering emails instead of speaking to me. 42 years of marriage reduced to logistical conversations and polite routines. Did you pay the electric bill? What time is Emily arriving next weekend? The gardener said the hydrangeas need replacing. Somewhere along the years, we stopped sounding like people who loved each other and started sounding like co-workers managing shared property. That afternoon, while Thomas napped downstairs in his recliner with financial news murmuring softly from the television, I sat alone in the sunroom scrolling through old photographs on my phone. Charleston sunlight filtered through white curtains while ceiling fans spun lazily overhead against the summer heat. There we were 10 years earlier dancing at Emily's wedding, Thomas holding my waist tightly while smiling against my hair. Another photo from our anniversary trip to Maine showed him kissing my cheek beside a lighthouse, while ocean wind whipped my scarf around both of us. I stared at those pictures for a long time wondering where that version of my husband disappeared. Or maybe more honestly, when, around 5 o'clock, I heard Thomas laughing softly downstairs. Actual laughter. Warm. Unforced. The sound startled me enough that I immediately walked toward the staircase before stopping halfway down. Thomas sat alone in the living room, holding his phone loosely in one hand while smiling at the screen. His expression looked younger somehow. Lighter. I had not seen that face directed toward me in years. The moment he noticed me standing there, the smile vanished instantly. What is so funny? I asked carefully. Too carefully. He locked the phone immediately and set it face down beside him. Just something from an old colleague. Colleague. Another vague answer arriving too quickly. I nodded like I believed him because apparently that had become my role inside this marriage. The woman who politely accepted distance without demanding explanations. Later that evening, while washing dishes after dinner, I found myself staring at my reflection in the dark kitchen window instead of the sink full of plates. Gray strands had started appearing more noticeably around my temples despite expensive salon appointments every 6 weeks. Fine lines deepened around my mouth. My body looked softer now in ways magazines politely call graceful aging. For the first time in my life, I wondered whether Thomas stopped touching me because I simply became difficult to desire. The thought settled heavily into my chest because once insecurity enters a marriage, it poisons even ordinary moments afterward. The next morning, I booked a consultation at an upscale salon downtown and spent nearly $400 on highlights, skincare treatments, and a new haircut that made me feel slightly ridiculous walking back to the car afterward. Still, when I arrived home that afternoon, part of me carried pathetic hope anyway. Thomas glanced up from his newspaper while I stood awkwardly in the doorway waiting for him to notice. "Did you do something different?" he asked eventually. My stomach tightened instantly. "My hair. Looks nice." Then his eyes returned immediately to the business section. Nice again. Always nice. Never beautiful. Never desirable. Never anything that sounded like a husband looking at his wife with hunger or tenderness or even curiosity anymore. That night, after Thomas disappeared downstairs around 10 o'clock with another excuse about insomnia, I opened the bathroom cabinet and quietly threw away 3 expensive anti-aging creams I bought months earlier. Tiny glass jars promising renewal and radiance to women terrified of becoming invisible. Watching them hit the trash can felt strangely freeing and devastating at the same time. Around midnight, unable to sleep again, I wandered downstairs for tea and noticed Thomas's office door slightly open. Light spilled softly into the hallway beneath it. I almost walked past before hearing another laugh from inside. Lower this time. Intimate somehow. My chest tightened immediately. I moved closer quietly without thinking and caught the final few words before silence followed. I miss you too. Then the office chair scraped sharply against hardwood floors, and I stepped backward instinctively just before Thomas opened the door. His expression changed the instant he saw me standing there in my robe, holding a tea mug. "What are you doing awake?" he asked too quickly. "Could not sleep." My voice sounded small even to me. "Who were you talking to?" He hesitated barely a second before answering. "Business call from California. At midnight. In Charleston. During retirement." I nodded anyway because part of me still desperately wanted explanations that hurt less than suspicion. Thomas brushed past me toward the staircase without another word. I remained standing alone in the hallway afterward while his office light stayed glowing behind me, and cold tea trembled slightly inside my hands. Then slowly, for the first time in 3 years, another possibility entered my mind clearly enough that I could no longer push it away. Maybe my husband was not emotionally distant because he stopped wanting intimacy altogether. Maybe he simply stopped wanting it with me. After that night outside Thomas's office, sleep became almost impossible for me. Charleston nights always carried sound differently inside old Southern houses. Floorboards creaked softly. Ceiling fans hummed against the humidity. Rain tapped against tall windows during late summer storms. For years those noises felt comforting, familiar. But now every sound made me wonder whether my husband was downstairs whispering to someone else while I lay alone in our king-sized bed pretending not to notice my marriage disappearing. I started waking up exhausted every morning because my mind refused to rest anymore. Around 2 or 3 o'clock, I often wandered downstairs barefoot and found Thomas asleep in his recliner with his phone resting against his chest. The screen always faced downward now. That detail bothered me more than it should have. Married people only start hiding ordinary objects once honesty becomes dangerous. One Thursday afternoon, I drove downtown for lunch with Caroline Reed at our usual cafe near the harbor. Caroline had been my closest friend for nearly 30 years. We met through charity work when Emily was still in middle school, and over time she became woven into every important memory of my adult life. Vacations together in Savannah, wine weekends in Napa, long hospital waiting rooms after my husband's heart procedure. She knew every private insecurity I ever confessed about marriage, aging, and loneliness. That afternoon, Charleston felt unbearably hot. Tourists moved slowly through the historic district carrying shopping bags while horse carriages rolled past beneath giant oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. Inside the cafe, ceiling fans turned lazily overhead while jazz music played softly near the bar. Caroline looked beautiful in the effortless way wealthy Southern women often do after 60. White linen blouse, gold bracelets, perfectly styled blonde hair that somehow never moved even in Charleston humidity. "You look tired," she said immediately after sitting down. I smiled faintly while unfolding my napkin across my lap. "I have not been sleeping much." Her expression softened with concern. "Still having trouble with Thomas?" I hesitated before answering because saying things aloud somehow made them more real. "I think he might be hiding something from me." Caroline reached across the table gently. "Maggie." 3 years, Caroline. My voice stayed low enough that nearby diners could not hear us. 3 years without him touching me like a husband. Pain flickered across her face immediately. "Have you confronted him directly?" I looked down at the untouched breadbasket between us. "And say what exactly?" "That my own husband looks happier texting strangers at midnight than sitting beside me at dinner." Caroline sighed softly. "Maybe he is depressed." Depressed. Everyone always searched for explanations that sounded less humiliating than rejection. "Maybe," I whispered. But even while saying it, something inside me already knew better. Lunch stretched quietly afterward while Caroline changed subjects carefully, telling stories about her grandchildren and upcoming charity auctions downtown. Yet every few minutes, I noticed her checking her phone discreetly beside the wine glass, smiling slightly at messages before quickly locking the screen again. Normally, I would never pay attention to something so small. But once suspicion enters your marriage, you begin noticing everything. Later that evening, after returning home, I found Thomas in unusually good spirits for the first time in months. He stood in the kitchen opening a bottle of expensive red wine, while Sinatra played softly through the living room speakers. "Thought we could have dinner outside tonight," he said casually. For one dangerous second, hope rushed through me, so suddenly it physically hurt. Maybe I imagined everything. Maybe he finally wanted to reconnect. I changed into a soft navy dress before dinner and even put on the perfume Thomas once bought me in Paris years earlier during happier versions of our marriage. We ate grilled salmon on the porch beneath glowing lantern lights, while summer rain cooled the Charleston air around us. Thomas smiled more that evening than he had in months. He even touched my wrist briefly while reaching for the wine bottle, and the contact startled me enough that I nearly dropped my fork. Imagine becoming so emotionally starved that accidental touch feels intimate. Around dessert, his phone buzzed against the table. I watched the exact moment his entire expression changed while reading the message. Softer, warmer, alive, then immediately guarded once he realized I noticed. "Everything all right?" I asked carefully. "Just business." Business again. At nearly 10 o'clock at night. During retirement. I nodded silently while rain tapped softly against the porch roof around us. Then suddenly Thomas stood from the table. "I need to take this inside." I remained alone on the porch afterward, listening to muffled laughter drift faintly through the open kitchen window while my untouched dessert melted slowly in the summer heat. Something inside me cracked quietly then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough that denial finally stopped protecting me from the obvious truth sitting directly in front of me. 2 days later, while cleaning the upstairs bathroom cabinets, I found a hotel receipt buried inside Thomas's blazer pocket. Charleston Harbor Resort. Tuesday night. 2 guests. Wine service for 2. My hands went completely numb holding the paper beneath the bright bathroom lights. Thomas told me he spent that evening at a retirement investment seminar in Colombia. I remembered because I ate reheated soup alone in the kitchen while watching old movies and trying not to feel abandoned again. For several long seconds, I simply stood there staring at the receipt while rain clouds gathered heavily outside the bedroom windows. Then slowly, another memory surfaced sharp enough to steal my breath completely. Tuesday night was also the same evening Caroline suddenly canceled lunch plans with me, claiming she had a terrible migraine. I sat down hard against the edge of the bathtub while cold fear moved slowly through my chest. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, my loneliness no longer felt abstract. It suddenly had names, places, lies carefully arranged around it. And deep down, before I even allowed myself to think it consciously, part of me already knew exactly whose messages made my husband smile in the dark. For 3 days after finding the hotel receipt, I carried the folded piece of paper inside my purse everywhere, like something poisonous I could not throw away. I did not confront Thomas immediately, partly because I was afraid of hearing the truth spoken aloud, but mostly because once suspicion attached itself to Caroline too, my entire life suddenly felt unstable in ways I could barely process. Betrayal from a husband hurts differently than betrayal from a friend. One breaks your heart. The other rewrites your memories. Every conversation with Caroline afterwards sounded strange to me. Artificial somehow. When she called Tuesday afternoon asking whether I wanted to meet for coffee downtown, I almost laughed at the normalness of her voice. "I have been worried about you," she said warmly through the phone. "You sounded exhausted at lunch last week." I stood alone in the kitchen staring at magnolia trees swaying outside the windows while her words settled heavily against my chest. "I have not been sleeping well," I answered carefully. "You should take better care of yourself, Maggie." The hypocrisy nearly stole my breath. But instead of accusing her, I agreed to meet for coffee the following afternoon because suddenly I needed to see her face while my suspicions remained silent between us. Charleston felt unbearably humid the next day. Tourists crowded the sidewalks near King Street, carrying shopping bags while horse carriage guides repeated the same historic facts to groups wearing sunglasses and linen hats. I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early and chose a small table near the back beneath slow-turning ceiling fans. Caroline walked in wearing white capri pants and a soft green blouse Thomas once complimented during one of our dinner parties. "That color suits you beautifully," he told her while I poured wine in the kitchen, pretending not to notice how brightly she smiled afterward. Suddenly, that memory felt different too. Everything did. You look pale, Caroline said immediately after sitting down. I forced a small smile. Just tired. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. You know you can tell me anything, right? Tears burned instantly behind my eyes hearing that because for 30 years, I genuinely believed it. Caroline attended Emily's graduation, my father's funeral, every milestone and heartbreak inside my adult life. I once trusted her enough to leave house keys with her during vacations. Now I sat across from her wondering whether she spent Tuesday nights sleeping with my husband while I reheated soup alone in our kitchen. Have you ever felt lonely inside a marriage? I asked suddenly before I could stop myself. Caroline's expression changed almost invisibly. Not guilt exactly. Caution. What kind of question is that? An honest one. She looked down at her coffee cup briefly before answering. I think every long marriage goes through seasons. Seasons. Another polite word disguising emotional starvation. What if the season lasts 3 years? Caroline finally looked directly at me then, and for one terrible second, I saw something unfamiliar in her eyes. Not friendship. Awareness. Thomas loves you, she said quietly. The certainty in her voice chilled me instantly. Not because of the words themselves. Because she answered too quickly, too confidently, as though she discussed my marriage with him more often than I realized. I nodded slowly while the cafe noise blurred softly around us. Sometimes I wonder if he even sees me anymore. Caroline reached for my hand again. Men get strange as they age. I almost laughed hearing her defend him automatically. Then suddenly another memory surfaced sharp enough to make my stomach twist. Last Christmas party at our house, I walked into the dining room unexpectedly and found Thomas standing unusually close to Caroline near the wine cabinet. They stepped apart immediately when they noticed me. At the time, I thought nothing of it because trust makes people blind in very specific ways. You know what the saddest part is? I asked quietly while staring into my untouched coffee. I spent years thinking something was wrong with me. Caroline's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. Maggie, I bought expensive creams. Lost weight. Changed my hair. I smiled faintly though the expression hurt physically. Meanwhile, my husband could barely look at me long enough to notice. Silence settled heavily between us, while dishes clattered softly behind the cafe counter. Then Caroline whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. Sometimes people grow apart. There it was. Not denial. Not shock. Just quiet acceptance disguised as wisdom. Suddenly the hotel receipt burning inside my purse no longer felt like suspicion. It felt like confirmation waiting for courage. I stood slowly from the table before finishing my coffee. Caroline frowned immediately. Are you all right? I looked down at the woman who once knew every private fear inside my marriage while possibly helping destroy it behind my back. No, I answered honestly. But I think I finally understand why. Her face lost color almost instantly. Just enough to tell me everything I needed to know without another word. I left the cafe afterward and walked aimlessly through Charleston for nearly 2 hours while summer storms gathered darkly over the harbor. The city looked beautiful in that tragic southern way it always does before heavy rain. Church bells echoed through humid air. Palm trees bent softly in rising wind. Somewhere nearby, jazz music drifted from an open restaurant doorway while tourists laughed beneath awnings, completely unaware that my entire life was quietly collapsing around me. By the time I returned home, thunder rolled heavily across the sky outside. Thomas sat alone in the living room reading financial reports exactly like every other evening. You are home late, he said without looking up. I stood in the doorway watching the man I married 42 years earlier while rain finally started hitting the windows hard enough to shake the old glass slightly. Then slowly, I pulled the hotel receipt from my purse and placed it silently on the coffee table in front of him. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas looked truly awake. Thomas stared at the hotel receipt for a very long time before touching it. Rain hammered steadily against the tall Charleston windows, while thunder rolled low across the harbor outside. The living room smelled faintly like leather furniture and the bourbon he always poured himself after dinner. For years, that room felt safe to me. Familiar. Now it suddenly looked like the set of somebody else's marriage entirely. Where did you get this? He asked quietly without looking up. Interesting how quickly guilty people ask the wrong question first. Not denial. Not confusion. just concern about discovery. I remained standing near the doorway with both hands clasped tightly together because suddenly I no longer trusted them not to shake. Your jacket pocket. Thomas leaned back slowly in the recliner and closed his eyes briefly like an exhausted man preparing for difficult negotiations instead of a husband caught betraying his wife. Maggie, please do not lie to me again. My voice sounded calmer than I expected, almost detached. That frightened me more than anger would have. Silence settled heavily between us while rain blurred the gas lanterns outside into soft gold smears against the dark street. Finally, Thomas placed the receipt carefully on the coffee table and looked directly at me for the first time in months. How much do you already know? There it was. Confirmation arriving not through confession, but surrender. My stomach twisted painfully anyway. Enough. He rubbed one tired hand across his face before speaking again. It was never supposed to happen this way. Every affair probably begins with that sentence eventually. People destroy entire lives while still imagining themselves tragic instead of selfish. How long? I asked quietly. Thomas stared toward the rain outside instead of answering immediately. Almost 4 years. For years. Longer than the silence in our marriage itself. Which meant while I spent 3 years blaming age, menopause, and emotional distance for the absence of affection between us, my husband had already given that intimacy to someone else entirely. Caroline. He nodded once. Very slightly. The room tilted around me for a moment. Not because I did not already suspect it. Because hearing her name spoken aloud made the betrayal real in a way suspicion never fully manages. I lowered myself slowly into the chair across from him, because suddenly my legs no longer felt steady. My best friend. Thomas swallowed hard, but said nothing. Rain continued pounding against the windows while somewhere upstairs an old pipe rattled softly inside the walls. Ordinary house sounds surrounding the collapse of a 42-year marriage. Did everyone know? I whispered eventually. He looked genuinely startled by the question. What? At the club. The charity board. Our friends. Shame burned hotter than heartbreak now. Was I the only person stupid enough not to notice? No, his answer came too quickly. Too defensively. Which somehow answered me anyway. Tears blurred my vision immediately, but I refused to let them fall yet. I trusted both of you. Thomas leaned forward suddenly. Maggie, it was not planned. I almost laughed hearing that because men always imagine spontaneity makes betrayal more forgivable somehow. 4 years sounds very planned to me. He fell silent again. Then finally he said the sentence that shattered something inside me completely. I stopped knowing how to talk to you. The cruelty of those words did not come from volume. They came from timing. Because for 3 years I had desperately blamed myself for our emotional distance, while Thomas quietly built intimacy with another woman instead of trying honesty with his wife. So instead of speaking to me, I said softly, you slept with my best friend. It was not just physical. Somehow that made it worse. Much worse. I stood abruptly and walked toward the kitchen because suddenly the living room felt impossible to breathe inside. Thomas followed slowly behind me while lightning flashed across the dark Charleston sky outside. I never wanted to hurt you, he said quietly from the doorway. I turned toward him, then and finally the tears came. You let me spend years believing I was undesirable. My voice cracked sharply now. Do you understand what that does to a woman? Thomas looked down immediately because deep down, I think he did understand. I watched you avoid touching me. Avoid kissing me. Sleep downstairs. Tears blurred my vision harder now. And every single night, I blamed myself instead of you. He moved toward me instinctively, then like he wanted to comfort me. The irony almost made me physically sick. Do not. I whispered sharply while stepping backward. Thomas froze immediately. Maggie. 3 years, I repeated softly. 3 years without my husband touching me while he still had tenderness left for somebody else. Silence swallowed the kitchen afterward while rain battered the windows hard enough to shake the glass. Finally, I asked the question that terrified me most. Do you love her? Thomas closed his eyes briefly before answering. Yes. There are moments in life where pain becomes strangely quiet because your heart simply cannot process more damage at once. Hearing that word felt exactly like that. Not explosive. Not dramatic, just final somehow. I nodded slowly while gripping the kitchen counter hard enough my knuckles turned white. Does she love you? He hesitated. That hesitation told me more than the answer itself. I think so. I laughed softly, then through tears, because suddenly everything looked pathetic instead of romantic. Two wealthy retirees sneaking around hotel rooms and pretending emotional confusion justified betrayal while their spouses trusted them completely. Emily cannot know yet, Thomas said carefully after a long silence. There it was. Reputation. Appearances. Even now, protecting comfort mattered more to him than my devastation. I looked at the man standing in my kitchen and realized something horrifying. My husband had not emotionally disappeared because he became old or tired or depressed. He disappeared because he spent years slowly building another emotional life somewhere else, while leaving me trapped inside the shell of our marriage alone. Outside, thunder rolled heavily across Charleston while rain flooded the old streets beneath our windows. And standing there in the kitchen beside the man I loved for most of my adult life, I finally understood why sleeping alone never felt temporary. Thomas had already left me years before I ever found the receipt proving it. After Thomas admitted he loved Caroline, something inside our house changed immediately. Not loudly. Nothing dramatic happened the next morning. The coffee maker still started automatically at 6. The newspaper still landed against the front porch with the same dull thud. Charleston humidity still pressed heavily against the windows, while ceiling fans turned lazily overhead. But beneath all those ordinary routines, the illusion of my marriage had finally died. For 3 years, I thought I was grieving affection slowly disappearing. In reality, I had been living beside betrayal already fully formed. Thomas moved into the downstairs guest room permanently after that night. He did not announce it officially. He simply stopped pretending he belonged upstairs anymore. The first morning afterward, I walked into the kitchen wearing my robe and found him sitting at the table reading financial reports exactly like every other day. Coffee, he asked politely. Politely. Like we were distant relatives sharing vacation property, instead of two people whose entire life together just shattered beneath a summer thunderstorm. No thank you. My voice sounded strangely calm now, detached enough that it frightened me slightly. Thomas glanced up from the newspaper carefully. Maggie, I never wanted to hurt you. I almost laughed hearing that, because nobody spends for years lying to their wife and her closest friend accidentally. You just accepted hurting me as necessary, I answered quietly before walking back upstairs. The following weeks passed in unbearable silence. Not fighting. Silence. That somehow felt worse. Thomas still left for meetings twice a week. Caroline still texted occasionally, pretending friendship had not exploded into something grotesque and unrecognizable. Thinking about you, she wrote 3 days after the confession. I stared at the message for nearly 10 minutes before deleting it without responding. Thinking about me while sleeping with my husband for 4 years. The cruelty of that almost impressed me. One evening around sunset, I sat alone on the upstairs balcony watching summer rain gather over Charleston Harbor when Emily called unexpectedly. Mom, she said immediately, are you all right? My stomach tightened instantly. Why would you ask that? Silence. Then carefully, Dad has been acting strange lately. Of course he had. Men who maintain secret lives for years rarely know how to behave once the secret stops protecting them emotionally. Your father and I are having some difficulties. Emily sighed softly through the phone. Mom, I am 41 years old. Please stop protecting me from things. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes hearing that, because suddenly I realized I had spent most of my adult life protecting everyone else from discomfort while quietly carrying unbearable truths alone. Your father has been seeing someone, I whispered finally. Silence swallowed the line completely afterward. Then came the question I dreaded most. Who? I closed my eyes against the gathering rain outside. Caroline. Emily inhaled sharply like the word physically struck her. Aunt Caroline? Hearing her called, Aunt suddenly made the betrayal feel even uglier somehow. For 4 years apparently. Another long silence followed before Emily finally whispered, Oh my God. I waited for anger, shock, questions. Instead, my daughter simply sounded heartbroken for me in a way nobody else had yet. Mom, she said softly, this is not your fault. Those words nearly destroyed me because until that moment, some hidden part of me still believed maybe it was. Maybe aging too visibly or becoming emotionally predictable somehow justified emotional abandonment after 42 years of marriage. I keep thinking if I had noticed sooner. No, Emily's voice sharpened unexpectedly. People do not accidentally have 4-year affairs because their wives age. Tears slipped silently down my face, then while rain finally started falling hard against the balcony railings outside. Sometimes you do not realize how deeply shame settled inside you until somebody finally removes it gently. Later that same week, while sorting financial paperwork in Thomas's office looking for insurance records, I discovered something far worse than infidelity. At first, the documents looked ordinary. Retirement statements, investment accounts, property taxes. Then slowly, details started aligning in ways that made my stomach turn cold. Large withdrawals from joint retirement funds over 3 years. Trust modifications. Quiet property transfers connected to limited liability companies I had never heard of before. One document stopped me completely. A luxury condo purchased downtown 18 months earlier under a holding company linked directly to Thomas's secondary investment account. The listed emergency contact beneath the paperwork read Caroline Reed. I sat frozen inside the office chair staring at the document while late afternoon sunlight faded slowly through the shutters around me. My husband had not only emotionally left me years ago, he had been financially preparing another life the entire time, while I still shared his last name and balanced holiday budgets, believing we were simply struggling through a difficult season of marriage. Suddenly, every conversation about retirement planning looked different in my memory. Every suggestion to simplify our finances. Every delayed vacation. Every discussion about market losses and careful budgeting. Lies layered carefully enough to look practical instead of calculated. I picked up my phone immediately and called Dr. Alan Pierce, the attorney who handled our estate planning years earlier after Thomas's heart surgery. "Margaret," he answered warmly. "Everything all right?" I looked around the office filled with financial papers and decades of betrayal hidden beneath neat folders and legal signatures. Then quietly, for the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped sounding confused. "No," I answered calmly, "but I think I finally understand what has really been happening inside my marriage." Outside the office windows, rain continued flooding the Charleston streets while downstairs, I heard Thomas moving quietly through the kitchen, unaware that the woman he spent years emotionally starving had finally stopped searching for affection and started searching for truth instead. Dr. Alan Pierce's office overlooked Charleston Harbor from the 4th floor of an old brick building downtown. Rain still clung to the windows the morning I arrived, turning the city outside into soft gray watercolor shapes beneath the storm clouds. I sat across from Alan's desk, holding copies of trust documents and account transfers, while the smell of coffee and old books filled the quiet office around us. Alan adjusted his glasses slowly while reviewing the paperwork in silence. The older I became, the more I learned that silence from professionals usually meant bad news. Finally, he looked up at me with visible concern. "Margaret," he said carefully, "did Thomas discuss any of these changes with you personally?" I stared down at the highlighted transfers spread across the desk. "No." Alan leaned back slowly in his chair. "Several retirement accounts were quietly restructured 18 months ago. Ownership percentages shifted significantly." My stomach tightened immediately. "Into Caroline's name?" He hesitated briefly before answering. "Indirectly. Through a secondary trust connected to the condominium property." Condominium. Such a clean-sounding word for betrayal hidden beneath legal paperwork. Outside the office windows, rain slid slowly down the glass while traffic moved through flooded Charleston streets below. "Can he do that legally?" I asked quietly. Alan folded both hands together across the desk. "Not without disclosure if marital assets were involved." There it was. Confirmation. Not only had my husband emotionally abandoned me years earlier, he spent those same years financially preparing an entirely separate future while allowing me to believe we were still building retirement together. I thought betrayal would feel explosive once fully exposed. Instead, it felt cold. Administrative almost. Like discovering your marriage slowly disappeared inside spreadsheets and signatures while you still folded laundry and hosted dinner parties upstairs. "There is something else," Alan said gently. I closed my eyes briefly before nodding. "Go ahead." Thomas updated his estate trust 9 months ago. My heartbeat slowed strangely hearing that. Not from calmness. From shock too deep for immediate reaction. Without telling me, Alan gave me a look filled with professional sympathy. "Margaret, most of his primary beneficiary structure changed completely." "Caroline." "Of course." I looked toward the rain outside while 42 years of marriage quietly rearranged themselves into something unrecognizable. Suddenly, every conversation Thomas avoided made sense. Every emotionally distant evening. Every polite refusal of affection. He was not struggling inside our marriage anymore. He was exiting it carefully while making sure his finances escaped before honesty arrived. "What are my options?" I asked softly. Alan studied me carefully across the desk. "First, you need copies of everything." Quietly, I nodded once. "Second, you stop assuming Thomas feels guilty enough to protect you financially out of decency." That sentence hurt more than I expected because some hidden part of me still wanted to believe the man I loved for most of my adult life would eventually remember kindness. "I do not think I know him anymore," I whispered. Alan sighed quietly. People reveal themselves very clearly once they start protecting desire instead of loyalty. By the time I returned home that afternoon, the rain had stopped completely. Charleston looked washed clean beneath pale sunlight, while humid air rose from sidewalks and old brick streets downtown. Thomas's car already sat in the driveway. Through the front windows, I could see him standing in the kitchen speaking softly on his phone. The moment I stepped inside, he ended the call immediately. "Where were you?" he asked too casually. "Meeting with Alan Pierce." Silence filled the kitchen instantly. Tiny. Sharp. Thomas set his phone down slowly against the counter. "Why?" I removed my coat carefully before answering, because suddenly I wanted him uncomfortable enough to feel the truth pressing against him for once. I wanted help understanding why my husband transferred large portions of our retirement assets into hidden trusts connected to another woman. Thomas looked exhausted immediately. Older somehow. "Maggie, do not." My voice stayed calm enough to frighten even me. "I spent years begging silently for affection while you quietly reorganized your finances for a future without me." He rubbed both hands across his face. "It was complicated." I almost laughed hearing that because wealthy men always describe betrayal like difficult accounting instead of cruelty. "No," I answered softly. "It was calculated." Thomas looked toward the kitchen window where rainwater still dripped steadily from magnolia trees outside. I was trying to avoid destroying everything all at once. Tears burned behind my eyes instantly hearing that. "You destroyed it slowly instead." Silence settled heavily between us while the grandfather clock ticked faintly in the hallway nearby. Finally, Thomas whispered something I never expected to hear. "I stayed because leaving felt impossible." The honesty of that sentence hurt more than lies somehow. Not because he loved me enough to remain. Because convenience kept him beside me while intimacy belonged to somebody else entirely. "You let me hate myself for years," I said quietly. "Do you understand that?" He closed his eyes briefly. "I know. I thought aging made me undesirable." My voice cracked slightly now despite my efforts. "Meanwhile, you still had tenderness left. Just not for me." Thomas leaned heavily against the counter, looking suddenly smaller inside our kitchen than I had ever seen him before. "I never meant for you to feel worthless." Worthless. Funny word considering I spent 3 years shrinking emotionally while my husband invested love, money, and future plans somewhere else. "Intentions stopped matching a long time ago," I answered softly. Then I walked upstairs without another word and locked the bedroom door behind me for the first time in 42 years of marriage. That night, while thunder rolled faintly over Charleston Harbor again and humid rain tapped softly against the old windows, I sat alone at the vanity table staring at my reflection beneath warm bathroom lights. The woman looking back at me no longer appeared desperate for affection. She looked tired, betrayed, awake. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped wondering how to save my marriage and started wondering how much of myself I could still save instead. 2 nights after I locked the bedroom door, Thomas knocked softly around midnight while rain moved gently through Charleston outside. I sat awake beside the window reading legal documents Alan emailed earlier that evening. Trust structures, retirement transfers, property records connected to the condominium downtown. Every page felt like another layer of my marriage quietly unraveling beneath neat signatures and account numbers. "Maggie." Thomas's voice sounded muted through the wood. "Can we talk?" For several seconds, I considered pretending to sleep. Then exhaustion finally outweighed avoidance. "Come in." He entered slowly carrying 2 glasses of wine neither of us really wanted. The bedroom looked unfamiliar with him standing there now. Not because the furniture changed, because intimacy had. He placed one glass carefully on my nightstand before sitting at the edge of the armchair near the window instead of beside me on the bed. Even during confrontation, distance remained instinctive between us. "Alan called me today," he said quietly. Of course he did. Wealthy couples in Charleston protect appearances first and legal exposure second. I assumed he might. Thomas rubbed one tired hand across his face while rain tapped softly against the old windows around us. "You are moving quickly." I looked down at the papers resting in my lap. "You moved first." Silence settled heavily afterward, the kind filled with years neither of us knew how to repair anymore. Finally, Thomas exhaled slowly and whispered, "I never wanted this to become ugly." I almost laughed hearing that because ugly things rarely announce themselves loudly at first. They grow quietly beneath politeness and neglected honesty until eventually everything beautiful rots underneath. "You had 4 years to prevent ugly," I answered softly. "Instead, you built another life while leaving me trapped inside a marriage you emotionally abandoned." He lowered his eyes immediately. "I know." "No," I said gently. "I do not think you do." The rain intensified outside, while lightning flashed faintly over the harbor in the distance. I stared at the man sitting across from me and suddenly realized how old we both looked now. Not physically, emotionally. 42 years of shared life ending not with screaming or shattered dishes, but exhaustion and paperwork. "Do you remember our anniversary trip to Maine?" I asked unexpectedly. Thomas looked confused for a moment before nodding slowly. "Of course. You held my hand the entire ferry ride because I was afraid of the water." Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. "I keep thinking about that version of us." Thomas swallowed hard. "Maggie, when exactly did you stop loving me?" He closed his eyes briefly like the question physically hurt him. "I do not know. That is not true." My voice remained calm enough to frighten even me now. "People do not wake up in 4-year affairs accidentally." He stared toward the rain outside before finally speaking again. "I think after retirement, everything changed." There it was. The explanation men offer when they want emotional complexity to excuse betrayal. How? I felt invisible. The irony nearly stole my breath. Invisible. Thomas nodded slowly. "I spent decades working constantly, providing, solving problems. Then suddenly retirement came, and I did not know who I was anymore." I looked at him in disbelief. "So you found yourself in my best friend?" Pain flickered across his face then. Real pain, but not enough to make me soften anymore. "Caroline, listen to me." I laughed quietly hearing that, because suddenly the entire affair sounded painfully ordinary beneath all the devastation. Two aging people terrified of irrelevance reaching for validation instead of honesty. "You know what is strange?" I whispered softly. "For 3 years I thought something was wrong with me because my husband would not touch me anymore." Thomas looked down immediately. "Maggie, I bought expensive creams, lost weight, changed my hair." Tears finally slipped down my face despite my efforts. "Meanwhile, you came home from another woman and kissed my forehead like I was somebody's aunt." The shame inside those memories still hurt more deeply than anger itself. Thomas stood suddenly, then and crossed the room toward me before stopping several feet away. "I never meant to make you feel unwanted." I looked directly at him through tears. "But you did." Silence filled the bedroom while thunder rolled faintly across Charleston Harbor. Finally, Thomas whispered the sentence that ended whatever remained of our marriage emotionally. "I stayed because leaving felt cruel after so many years." There it was. Not love, obligation, convenience, guilt disguised as loyalty while intimacy belonged somewhere else entirely. I stared at him for several long seconds while something inside me finally hardened completely. "Do you understand what you are saying?" He looked exhausted now. "I am trying to be honest." "No," my voice stayed frighteningly calm. "You are trying to make cowardice sound compassionate." The words landed visibly. Thomas stepped backward slightly like I physically struck him. But for once, I no longer cared whether truth made him uncomfortable. "You did not stay because you loved me," I continued quietly. "You stayed because keeping me was easier than losing your reputation." Rain flooded the gutters outside hard enough to drown the silence afterward. Then slowly, I gathered the legal documents from the bed beside me and set them carefully onto the nightstand. "Alan says the trust transfers were illegal without disclosure." Thomas closed his eyes immediately. "Maggie, the condo ownership, the retirement restructuring, the hidden accounts." I looked directly at him. "You did not just betray me emotionally. You planned financially for life after me while still sleeping under my roof. For the first time all evening, real fear entered his expression. Not guilt. Fear. Because suddenly the consequences were no longer emotional conversations hidden inside rainy bedrooms. They were legal, public, permanent. What happens now? He asked quietly. I stared out the rain-covered window toward the dark Charleston streets below, while thunder rolled softly through the humid night. Then finally, after 3 years of loneliness and 4 years of betrayal hidden beneath polite routines, I answered honestly for the first time in far too long. Now, I whispered calmly. I stopped begging to be loved by someone who already chose somebody else. 8 months later, I woke up in a small coastal cottage in Maine to the sound of waves hitting the rocks below my bedroom window and realized I had slept through the entire night for the first time in years. No waiting for footsteps downstairs. No listening for whispered phone calls behind office doors. No wondering why my husband no longer touched me. Just ocean wind moving softly through white curtains and pale morning lights spilling across hardwood floors that belonged entirely to me. The cottage sat near a quiet stretch of coastline outside Camden, tucked between pine trees and cold Atlantic water. It was smaller than the Charleston house by almost 3,000 square feet, but somehow every room felt lighter. Cleaner. Honest. I rented it initially for only 3 months after the divorce settlement finalized. Then one morning while drinking coffee beside the ocean, I realized I had no desire to leave. Charleston carried too many ghosts now. Too many dinner parties and charity events built on appearances instead of truth. Here, nobody cared who betrayed whom at the country club. Nobody whispered over cocktails about trust funds or affairs hidden beneath polished Southern manners. People simply waved politely while buying lobster rolls and groceries downtown. The legal process ended faster than I expected once Alan uncovered the full extent of Thomas's hidden transfers. The court reversed several trust modifications entirely after proving marital assets had been concealed intentionally. Thomas looked exhausted during the final hearing. Older in ways no expensive tailoring could disguise anymore. Caroline never attended court once. According to Emily, she moved permanently into the downtown condominium after selling her Charleston home quietly months earlier. I never saw either of them again after the settlement. Not because I avoided them. Because eventually betrayal stops feeling personal. Once you finally understand, it says more about the betrayer than the abandoned person. Emily visited often now. Our relationship softened after everything because somewhere during the collapse of my marriage, my daughter stopped seeing me only as mom and started seeing me as a woman who survived something deeply humiliating with dignity intact. One rainy afternoon, while we folded laundry together inside the cottage, she looked at me carefully and asked, "Do you still miss him?" I stared out toward the gray Atlantic waves beyond the kitchen window while considering the question honestly. Sometimes I miss who I thought he was. Emily nodded slowly because she understood the difference. Missing a marriage is not always the same thing as missing the person inside it. What I mourned most was not Thomas himself anymore. It was the version of my life I trusted completely. The belief that 42 years guaranteed safety. Some nights I still thought about those 3 lonely years before discovering the affair fully. The expensive creams lined beside bathroom sinks. The diets. The quiet shame of wondering why my husband no longer desired me. Looking back now, I realized something painful but important. Emotional neglect changes women slowly. You begin apologizing for existing too loudly inside your own marriage. Shrinking emotionally until eventually silence feels safer than honesty. I spent years believing I needed to become more lovable again, while Thomas quietly invested his affection elsewhere. The tragedy was never my aging face or softer body. The tragedy was how quickly I accepted blame for another person's dishonesty. One afternoon in early October, while walking along the rocky shoreline collecting sea glass after a storm, my phone buzzed unexpectedly with a message from Thomas. The first direct contact in nearly 4 months. "I heard you moved to Maine." I stared at the words while cold ocean wind lifted my silver hair around my face. Then another message appeared. "I hope you are sleeping better there." Tears burned instantly behind my eyes reading that because despite everything, he remembered. He remembered the sleepless nights. The years I wandered through empty rooms carrying loneliness like something shameful. I typed 3 different responses before deleting all of them. Finally, I wrote only one sentence back. I finally stopped waiting to be loved. He never replied afterward. And strangely enough, that silence no longer hurt. Later that evening, I sat wrapped in a blanket beside the cottage fireplace while rain tapped softly against the windows and ocean waves crashed somewhere beyond the cliffs outside. A half-finished watercolor painting rested beside me on the table. Blue-gray shoreline beneath cloudy skies. Messy. Imperfect. Mine. I thought about the woman I had been 1 year earlier in Charleston. Standing alone in bathrooms, adjusting expensive makeup before dinners with a husband already emotionally gone. Listening to whispered phone calls through office doors while blaming herself for the distance inside her marriage. She felt like somebody I loved deeply now rather than somebody I still was. The hardest part of betrayal after 60 is not losing love. It is realizing how much life remains afterward despite believing your emotional story already finished. I used to think growing older meant becoming smaller somehow. Less visible, less desirable, less important. But sitting there beside the Atlantic Ocean with rain against the windows and peace finally settling softly inside my chest, I understood something completely different. There is extraordinary freedom in no longer begging for affection from people unwilling to give it honestly. The night grew colder outside while waves continued crashing steadily against the dark Maine shoreline below the cottage. I carried my tea toward the bedroom and paused briefly beside the mirror in the hallway. Silver hair, soft lines around my eyes, bare face untouched by expensive creams promising impossible youth. For the first time in years, I looked at my reflection without searching for reasons somebody stopped loving me. Then quietly, while ocean wind moved gently against the windows and the bed upstairs waited warm and empty in the best possible way, I turned off the lights and finally went to sleep without loneliness beside me.